Good morning. This is lecture number 26 in the ABCs of Communism series. We're going to now discuss the new class government in Russia in the next couple of lectures, including this one. After that, I expect that we'll go on to several lectures on dialectical materialism proper. Now, what I want to start out with is pointing out what we did the last time. You remember we were going through how Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet Union as a paid agent, and that he got the job done, and that brought us up to 1990-91 when the Soviet Union was finally dissolved. After the collapse of what was left of the Soviet Union under this great traitor Michael Gorbachev, we can see rather clearly 25 years later three stages to this whole process of what Russia went through under its new class government. I like to divide them into rape, reconstruction, and rearmament. There are two first to follow as keys in this study, and they are Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. You'll recall when we started talking about socialism in those lectures, we started with the two keys being Lenin and Stalin. Now we're going to use the same keys because we can and because we have to, really, if we're going to get to the core of what was going on in the last 25 years. The rape covers the period of the years 2000 until 2008, and they were nothing less than years of wholesale rape of the former Soviet Union, including the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic, which is now called the Russian Federation, and each of its associated republics in the former Soviet West. During that time, entire physical plants were uprooted by the Russian mafia and sold to any and every Western buyer. I had some personal experience in this as I was in touch with one of the groups of the Russian mafiosos in Los Angeles, and I had mentioned I would like to have downhole, open hole log tools and the equipment that would go along with it, and the manuals that would explain how this thing operated, or else an English-speaking technician. What I got was the tool. They put it on, and they stole it, and they put it on an airplane and then sent it to Los Angeles and said, well, here it is, and this is how much money we want for it. Well, the problem with that is that tool in and of itself was not enough. I needed the technical literature that went along with it, and or a technician that could speak English to explain how they were operating this particular tool. And in the end, I didn't buy it. Now, they might have sold it to Schlumberger, but Schlumberger already had access to these tools because the Schlumberger are the ones that had created the Soviet industry to begin with. So they probably sold it to Halliburton. I don't know who they sold it to. I know I didn't buy it. But at any rate, this is the sort of thing that was going on. If you wanted something over there, the mafia group would get it for you. And this mafia group was not monolithic. It had multiple components, just like you see with the five families in New York and their middle management, sopranos, so to speak, in New Jersey. There's a bunch of crews out there. They're all doing their own thing, making their money in their own way, and so the same thing is true of this Russian mafia group, but the ones I had connection with, I'll explain more about as we go along. The political theater that was being played out inside Russia consisted of the great traitor Gorbachev acting as president of the dying Soviet Union, the very organization that he was busy trying to destroy, versus the drunken fool Boris Yeltsin as president of the Russian Federation. It was in this shitstorm that both Putin and Medvedev entered the political picture as honest bureaucrats for the new class capitalist regime. Now, I'll just mention that not only was the mafia split into a bunch of different crews, all stealing on their own various projects, but the new class itself had several components. One of them was that component that went right along with the mafia groups and participated with them, and the other were, now we're going to see there was still some of the honest bureaucrats left, and these two men, Putin and Medvedev, were attracted to the Leningrad center, and we'll see how that developed as we go along. And from there, they managed to put together a political party that would get them elected, and they began their own private war, so to speak, against other new class elements and against the mafia groups. Now, what was different about the way in which the imperialists were raping the Soviet Union, it was that they didn't have their own troops on the ground. Now, you recall that when they occupied Germany and Japan, they had huge numbers of troops there, and they could pretty well tell those governments exactly what they wanted them to do. That is not the situation that existed within Russia in the years 2001 to 2008. What existed there was, yes, there were plenty of invading gringos and cops from the FBI and so on, who suddenly were allowed to get over there and set up offices, but that they didn't have all of these soldiers. They brought thugs with them from the United States, but that's not the same thing as occupying a country with troops. So it was possible for an honest new class group to retreat to a center that they controlled. And that center turned out to be Leningrad, which after 2001 was renamed St. Petersburg, and the story goes on from there. But it was the simple fact that the U.S. government didn't have its own troops on Russian soil that made an indigenous, autochthonous opposition of non-mafiosos possible. The man that came to power was Boris Yeltsin, and he was an interesting character because he had started out as a strong supporter of Gorbachev around 1985, but by 1990 he had become his most important political opponent. His personal failing was that he was an alcoholic, and that his alcoholism just got worse as time went on. What he had done was to introduce a program of what he called radical market-oriented reforms, which he also called shock therapy. What it really was financial terrorism of a new sort by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, with U.S. economic hitmen, a phrase that's become popular now, and a good example of it is Larry Summers. And these were the bandit chiefs that they were using. Now, the result for Russia had been disastrous, with the real GDP falling by more than 40% by 1999. Hyperinflation had wiped out personal savings, and this resulted in a widespread epidemic of crime and destitution, unknown in this part of the world since the Bolsheviks had rid the country of it under Felix Dzerzhinsky in the early part of Soviet history, and you may recall from reading chapters 13 and 15 how that developed, and of course we had some lectures on it. The most corrupt of the new class managers declared any properties they were familiar with to be privatized and owned by them. This was just a declaration. A payment, if it was ever made, was for silly, nominal amounts that never even approximated their true worth. In other words, the director of a factory during the Soviet regime would often now become the owner of that same enterprise. And under the color of official government decision, outrageous financial manipulations were performed that enriched a very narrow group of individuals who occupied essential positions of business and government. Knowing that this was an out-and-out theft that they were committing, many of these individuals promptly took their money to a modern hole-in-the-wall hideout somewhere in Western Europe. This produced enormous capital flight. By hole-in-the-wall, I mean exactly what you see in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where they have a hole in the wall in the far west out there, and they can retreat to there whenever they get done robbing a train, for example, or robbing a bank. Now, an incredible 20 billion US dollars were lent to this Russian new class mafia bankster group. And even at that time, sober, objective observers around the world noted that the International Monetary Fund was doing things that were totally illegal under its own charter. And obviously the reasons for that were the IMF bureaucrats had been suborned, or just told what to do, ordered about by the gringo regime on the Potomac, or the Wall Street ruling families that owned that government. Now, everyone knew that this money was being siphoned off as fast as it arrived in Russian accounts and directed into hot money accounts in these hole-in-the-wall safe spots in Switzerland or the UK or the US and many other places. Now, what we're going to do is go quickly to the two keys that we want to use. When we started our discussion of socialism, both in the book and in the lectures, we used the keys of the life history of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Now we're going to take a look at the life histories of Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. Taking Putin first, he was born on October 7th, 1952 in Leningrad of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic of the Soviet Union. And his parents were Vladimir Putin, who lived between 1911 and 1999 and was a Navy sailor, and Maria Putina, who lived from 1911 to 1998, who was a factory worker. His father served in the submarine fleet in the early 1930s, and early in the Second World War he served in the Cheka and was later transferred to the regular army, where he was severely wounded in 1942. Vladimir Putin's maternal grandmother was killed by the German occupiers of the Tver region in 1941, and her brothers, his maternal uncles, disappeared at the war front. He himself was the youngest of three boys. His two elder brothers, Victor and Albert, were born in the mid-1930s. Albert died within a few months of birth, and Victor died of diphtheria during the siege of Leningrad in World War II. So you can see here that Vladimir Putin is one of those many Russians who had personal losses from what the Nazis did to the Soviet Union of the most intimate nature. And this is important. Actually, there was no Russian family that didn't have at least somebody dead or wounded in the course of that war. The official figures are 27 million. There's good reason to believe that they're higher than that. Now, another factor that you should be aware of is that Putin was also connected to what you might think of as the Bolshevik aristocracy. His paternal grandfather, Spiridon Putin, who lived from 1879 to 1965, was a chef who at one time or another cooked for Vladimir Lenin, and then for Lenin's wife, Nadia Krupskaya, and later she passed him on to Joseph Stalin. It's hard to be much closer to the leadership of the Bolshevik Party than that, especially since the preparation of food for the top leaders has got to be done by people that you can trust not to poison them. On the 1st of September 1960, Vladimir started school at the elementary school across the lane from his house, known as School Number 193. He lived on Baskov Lane. Now, at 12 years of age, he started taking a serious interest in martial arts, something that you may know he has continued up to the present time. In his teenage years, Putin was eager to emulate the Soviet intelligence officers, which were characters being played out on the Soviet screen, and sometimes these included real agents like Michael Borodin and Richard Sorga. You'll recall that we spent a lot of time when we reviewed the Latin American countries on what Borodin had done when Lenin sent him to Mexico to set up the Mexican Communist Party and its international bureau to organize all of the other communist parties of Latin America. And you may recall that it was Richard Sorga that Stalin sent into the Nazi SS intelligence division. When he was a lieutenant colonel, he was transferred to the German embassy in Tokyo, and from there he was able to penetrate the German, by invitation, the Japanese general staff and get the information that Stalin absolutely had to have about what the Jap plans were to attack the Soviet Union in Siberia and Mongolia, if any, when the time came in 1941. Well, so this is the kind of stuff he grew up watching, much like many young people my age at the time grew up reading about James Bond. At my age at the time, I went into Army intelligence. Now, Lenin, when he became of age, had decided to become a lawyer. And you may recall that he had gotten his law degree and at Leningrad State University. Anyway, what became Leningrad State University, following in his footsteps, Vladimir Putin also decided to become a lawyer, and he entered the law department at Leningrad State University in 1970 and graduated in 1975. His final thesis was titled "The Most Favored Nation Trading Principle in International Law." Now, while he was at university, he joined the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and he remained a party member until the party itself was dissolved in December 1991. Here is a person that you want to remember that's going to be very important. His name is Anatoly Sobchak. He later played an important role in Putin's career and also that of Dmitry Medvedev. But at the time Putin first met him, Sobchak was an assistant professor lecturing in business law at the university there in Leningrad. And that was in Vladimir's major in law school, and it prepared him, that is the business end of this, in a unique way for the specific peculiarities of the tasks that would soon confront him. Sobchak, in other words, became his most important mentor. Now, Sobchak, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is going to become mayor of St. Petersburg, or mayor of Leningrad and then St. Petersburg. If you want to try to remember that name, you might remember that the movie The Big Lebowski, there's a Walter Sobchak who was the would-be mentor to the Dude. There's no resemblance between these two Sobchaks at all other than the name, but it is a memory trick you might use to remember Anatoly Sobchak because he's going to be extremely important. At any rate, after Putin graduated with his law degree in 1975, he immediately joined the Cheka, and the KGB sent him to their 401st school at Oktay, Leningrad for his training, and he spent a year there. Now, this school was the structural equivalent, for those of you who may not know it, of the U.S. Army School for Intelligence Training in Baltimore, Maryland, when I was there in 1960. Or in its new location since 1971 at Fort Huachuca, New Mexico. Putin then went on to work briefly in the second chief directorate of the KGB, the counterintelligence section in Moscow, and then he was transferred to the first chief directorate in Leningrad, where among his duties was the monitoring of foreign and consular officials. From 85 to 90, the KGB stationed Putin in Dresden, East Germany. And during that time, Putin was assigned to Directorate S. Now, that was the intelligence gathering unit composed of illegal spies, but he handled both legal and illegal spies. You remember that I defined these for you in a previous lecture. Legal spies, in Soviet terminology, are those that enter a country legally. That is, they come into customs, they have a passport, it probably is diplomatic, they may be assigned to a embassy someplace or to a trade mission, but at any rate they have legal status within the country. Illegal agents are spies that are sent in, like Steve Nelson, for example, we talked about in San Francisco, who have no legal status within the country and who therefore have false employment, false histories, and everything about their status in the country is fake. So they're called illegal agents. At any rate, one of Putin's jobs when he was in Dresden was to recruit young men and women for the purpose of sending them into industrial espionage, probably in the United States, but perhaps in Western Europe. And we also talked about how that program got started in previous lectures, and discussed it in the latter part of chapter 13 in your book. Now, Putin was in Dresden during the collapse of the GDR, and when a mob threatened to storm that KGB building there, Putin burned the KGB's files, and while he was doing that, he was sending frantic requests for orders from his bosses in the capital. And in his autobiography, Putin said Moscow was silent. At any rate, he was recalled to the Soviet Union. He returned to Leningrad in June of 1991, just before the actual collapse. Now, this was the end of the Cheka as such, but its functions were transferred to another agency called FSB, It was still in charge of secret work, however, and it directed Vladimir into the International Affairs section of Leningrad State University, and in his new job, Putin maintained surveillance on rampant treasonous activities of mafia agents and U.S. spies among the student body. And it was while working along these lines at Leningrad State University, Putin got reacquainted with his former professor, Anatoly Sobchak, who is now mayor of Leningrad. So you're beginning to see why Sobchak is so important here. Sobchak's other student that was going to be very important to us was Dmitry Medvedev. Now there's about 6 years of difference there in age, so Medvedev came into Leningrad State University under Sobchak after Putin had left. But now they both met each other as assistants to Sobchak, who is now mayor of Leningrad, and soon, when the name changes, mayor of St. Petersburg. So, in the St. Petersburg administration from 1990 to 1996, in May of 1990, Putin was appointed as an advisor on the international affairs to his mentor, Mayor Anatoly Sobchak. And then on 28th of June of that same year, on the following year, 91, he became head of the Committee for External Relations of the St. Petersburg Mayor's Office, with responsibility for promoting international relations and foreign investments. That committee, headed by Putin, also registered business ventures. Putin resigned from active state security services with the rank of lieutenant colonel on 20th of August 1991. This was the second day of the attempt to get rid of the great traitor Michael Gorbachev by military action. Putin later explained his decision against joining the plot, as he could see little future in supporting the plotters, as it was akin to joining a lost cause. Putin remained head of the Committee for External Relations until 1996, and from 94 to 96 he held several other political and governmental positions for Sobchak in St. Petersburg. Like Stalin under Lenin, Putin was becoming the man that was the manager, getting everything done for Sobchak. And you begin to see why the organizational basis he had for the climb he was about to make inside the Russian government. In March of 94, Putin became first deputy chairman of the government of St. Petersburg as a consequence. In other words, he's the new manager. Now, Putin enters politics as a party politician in 1995. In May of 95, Putin organized the St. Petersburg branch of the pro-government Our Home is Russia political party. That was the name of it. The Liberal Party, founded by Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin. Now, during the summer and autumn of 95, Putin managed the legislative election campaign for Our Home is Russia party, and from 1995 through June of 97, Putin led the St. Petersburg branch of Our Home is Russia party. Now, in the transitional rape years, in October 1991, Yeltsin had announced the shock therapy program, and it was specifically recommended by the economic hitmen that had been sent over there by the International Monetary Fund, one example of which is this Larry Summers. And one of the first things they wanted to do was to remove Soviet price controls, and so he put that into effect. Now, what this did was to allow prices to be jacked up to whatever the market would bear on whatever commodity. And everyone else just got fucked in this process. So, assuming the role as the continuing legally responsible entity for the Soviet Union, he also, that is Russia also under Yeltsin, took up the responsibility for settling all of the USSR's internal and external debts. Now, this turned out to be an early version of the idea of getting the government to front trillions to private banks and charging it to the public purse. One reason being that over half the population of the old USSR was no longer in the country. So you have half of the number of people that were producing before now responsible for this debt. The rape in its myriad of forms meant that the Russian GDP, gross domestic product, contracted, and it contracted an estimated 40% between 1991 and 1998. And this meant that honest bureaucrats like Mr. Putin, Mr. Medvedev realized that their country, Russia, was being driven into a Haiti-like poverty, despite the country's wealth of natural resources, its well-educated population, and its diverse, although increasingly dilapidated, industrial base. Critical manufacturing elements were seized as private property, stealing them from their previous status as government enterprises. Mafiosos began to call upon overseas sources of capital to take control of these public enterprises. And it was about this time that I met the first group of Russian mafiosos in the United States, Michael Smushkovich being one of them. We'll talk about him a little bit later. New class bureaucrats of the civilized variety were strong-armed into place or just killed, as the mafiosos wrote comprehensive commercial laws. By the time Putin's Our Home is Russia party started to fight back in 1996, it was almost too late to save Russia from being another narco-state type of government. As it was, the USSR was now reduced to being much like gangster-run USA of the post-JFK assassination years. We mentioned that the best new material about that is a video of 3 hours and 15 minutes, I believe, YouTube, called From JFK to 9/11, It's All a Rich Man's Trick. You definitely want to watch that, because it actually set aside everything after Mark Lane and Jim Garrison's early work on the matter and go straight to this guy, because he has the whole thing before and after, and I'm sure you will enjoy watching it, and you'll probably want to watch it several times, so that because there's so much data in there. The 3 years from 2000 to 2002 saw the introduction of a flat income tax in Russia of 13%. Now, these are the years that Putin has now assumed the presidency, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the important thing about this flat income tax, which is generally considered to be regressive if it were done over here, was that for the first time, small and medium-sized businesses in Russia could plan for their tax tax burden. Then rising prices for minerals, including oil and gas, were providing the Putin-managed Our Home is Russia government of the increasingly retired alcoholic President Yeltsin the necessary funds to fight the mafiosos and get industry moving again. So, in those years, the GDP grew on average of 7% per year, and disposable incomes more than doubled, and in dollar-denominated terms increased 800%. The volume of consumer credit between 2000 and 2006 increased 45 times, and this allowed a boom in private consumption. The number of people living below the poverty line declined from 30% in 2000 to 14% in 2008. The sharp decline in fertility rates that had characterized Russia under the great traitor Gorbachev and until 1996 suddenly leveled off and began to rise again, so that now they're getting people are feeling more confident. They're willing to have more children, and they see a future for themselves in Russia. Now, in the United States, the Gringo regime had to go from its wholesale robbing of Russia to regime change as its prime directive. The situation in Russia from 1990 to 1998 had begun to look like the situation in China after 1945, when the Chiang Kai-shek criminal gang focused almost entirely on stealing everything they could from their Yankee sponsors, as well as, of course, from the Chinese nation. Now, however, in the Russian case, the invading gringos had no troops to back up their raping other than the private hoodlums they brought with them. Chiang Kai-shek, at least, had had, first of all, the Japanese troops to support him, and then U.S. troops. But at any rate, the handwriting was on the wall as the State Security Service, under new Dzerzhinsky, began to clean up on organized crime and jail the economic chief criminals. Increasingly, they were forced to rely upon the U.S. government sponsors, and this was particularly true of those U.S. government criminals who now had to switch some of their own focus from robbing Russia and its republics to concentrating on getting rid of the Putin government in Moscow. Despite hyperinflation, the central bank aggressively expanded the currency supply to prevent appreciation of the ruble. Now, why would they do that? Well, for the U.S. imperialists, keeping Russia weak meant first always keeping its currency weak and unstable. Thus, stabilizing the ruble would become a necessary first objective for the new class government leader Vladimir Putin when he replaced Yeltsin in 1998. Now, let's take a look at the currency and the central bank. The new class Russian monetary system is managed by the Bank of Russia. Now, this bank had been founded on the 13th of July of 1990, while as the state bank of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. Now the Bank of Russia assumed responsibilities of being the central bank following the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. According to the new constitution, the Bank of Russia is an independent entity with the primary responsibility of protecting the stability of the national currency, that is, the ruble. It is also chief regulator and a lender of last resort for the banking industry in Russia. Now, the Bank of Russia is governed by a board of directors and headed by a governor who is appointed by the President of Russia. Large current account surpluses caused rapid real appreciation of the ruble between 2000 and 2008. These are the first years of the Putin administration. The mafiosos and their U.S. sponsors were no longer able to steal the accumulating money as fast as it came in. The Bank of Russia now aggressively accumulated foreign currency reserves, so that when capitalism collapsed in the USA in 2008, the Russian central bank policy evolved targeting a fixed exchange rate versus a basket of dollars and euros. After the Bank of Russia shifted its focus to inflation targeting, the last imperialist threat to the Russian currency was permanently disabled. Not that that would stop them from trying it repeatedly, and since they are deaf and dumb and being slow learners, it would take some time for them to reroute their subversive economic policies to something equally laughable. What they came up with was the idea of sanctions. Now, by April 2012, inflation had reached a record low of 3.6%. Now, that's only 3 years ago. Now, let's take a look at the evolution of the Yeltsin regime itself. Yeltsin was a politician in Russia who lived from 1931 to 2007. He was the first president, as we've seen, of the Russian Federation as it broke out of the Soviet Union, serving from 1991 to 1999. Boris Yeltsin emerged at first under the perestroika reforms of Gorbachev in 1985, and at that time he was one of Gorbachev's strongest supporters. But by 1990 he had become his most powerful political opponent. In May 1990, Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet. On the 12th of June of 91, he was elected by popular vote to the newly created post of President of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. Russia was still one of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union at that time, and would be for another 6 months. When the great traitor Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as head of the USSR, and then there was the final dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 25th of December of 91, Yeltsin remained in office as president of the Russian Federation, and he was re-elected there in 1996 after defeating in the second round the Communist Party chief, Mr. Zyuganov, by a margin of 13%. So, as you can see, the Communist Party was still the second biggest party in the country. However, Yeltsin never recovered his early popularity because of the economic and political crises of Russia that occurred during the 1990s. In fact, Yeltsin presided over the rape of Russia while mafia thugs raped the other republics. All of the USSR's wealth fell into the hands of a small group of new billionaire oligarchs who shamelessly likened them to the old American robber barons of the 1800s. Rather than creating new businesses, they just stole and sold off existing government industries. Furthermore, they took on the role of the old state trading monopolies. They also learned financialization from the gringo invaders, and they made fortunes arbitraging the huge difference between the old domestic prices for Russian commodities and the prices prevailing on the world market. Meanwhile, mafia thugs like Poroshenko and Yats raped the republics, and in the case of those particular traders, prepared to sell the republics to the U.S. imperialists for an attack on Russia. Much of the Yeltsin era was marked by widespread corruption, inflation, economic collapse, and this resulted in the enormous political and social problems. Within the first few years of his presidency, many of his political supporters turned against him, including his vice president Alexander Rutskoy, who denounced these so-called reforms as economic genocide, which of course they were. Ongoing confrontations with the Supreme Soviet climaxed in the crisis of October 1993, a constitutional crisis in which Yeltsin illegally ordered the dissolution of the parliament, which then attempted to remove him from office. In October 93, troops loyal to Yeltsin stopped an armed uprising by his opponents outside of the parliament building, leading to a number of deaths. Yeltsin then scrapped the existing constitution, temporarily banned political opposition, and deepened his economic experimentation. As far as he was concerned, it wasn't temporary, but it turned out to be a temporary ban on the communists. He introduced a new constitution with stronger presidential powers, and that constitution was passed by a referendum on December 12, 1993, with almost 59% of voters voting in favor of the new constitution. Now, on December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin announced his resignation, leaving the presidency in the hands of his chosen successor, then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin, like the great traitor before him, left office even more unpopular than Tsar Nicholas had been with the Russian people when he left office. Now, the Russian rape crisis of the 1990s goes through several phases. In late 1992, deteriorating economic conditions and a sharp conflict with the parliament forced Yeltsin to dismiss the neoliberal economic hitman Yegor Gaidar as prime minister. And his successor was Viktor Chernomyrdin, a former head of the state natural gas company, and as you have seen, a former chief of what was going on in the Leningrad area, and he was less addicted to neoliberal fascism, although by no means a really good guy. Boris Fedorov, a Gorbachev favorite, then became deputy prime minister as well as finance minister. And Fedorov tackled ruble stabilization as the primary goal of Russian economic policy, and he said he intended to support that with an anti-crisis program to control inflation through tight monetary and fiscal policies. But in practice, it soon became apparent that this was just another of the U.S. government's rape and ruin policies for Russia, where the U.S. government would control all of the currency and credit. Now, they wanted their now puppet RCB to increase interest rates on credits issued by the government in the form of bonds. Now, massive budget deficits, they figured, would weaken the economy and necessitate the closing of what they considered to be inefficient state enterprises. What they really wanted was to get their hands on all of these previously government-owned businesses, particularly the industrial ones. In 1993, these ruinous deficits were to be brought under control by limiting wage increases for state enterprises. That's how they turned out to what it really meant. Now, renewing wage scales quarterly, they wanted that done so that the unions didn't manage to raise them in different industries. The printing of currency and the domestic credit expansion moderated somewhat in 93, and in a public confrontation with Parliament, Yeltsin won a referendum on his economic policies. In May of 93, the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank agreed to reduce subsidies to working people. Of course, I was taking more money away from the people that actually work, and raised the discount lending rate for cap banks to reflect inflation. The IMF parasites were so happy they extended the first payment of US $1.5 billion to Russia from a special fund they had to create out of nothing called the Systemic Transportation Facility. Fedorov's anti-crisis program and the government's accord with the central bank had its desired effect in increasing the wheels of the economic rape. For example, in the first 3 quarters of 1993, the central bank pushed currency expansion to a monthly rate of 19%. Concomitantly, it expanded credit during that period by allowing capitalist banks to offer worthless derivatives as collateral. These are packaged IOUs of a highly questionable nature. An early version of what was going to happen in the United States in a few years, when worthless packages of U.S. mortgages were packaged up and then claimed to have some kind of legitimacy in terms of being a collateral, and then of course they didn't, and when that all came to a head, we had the economic collapse of 2008. Well, accordingly, the 1993, however, annual inflation rate turned out to be about 1,000%. So amazingly, these banksters, that is, bankers that are gangsters, declared this rate to be a sharp improvement over 1992. But even with their so-called improved figures, they had to fabricate these figures because the state expenditures were just set over at accounting until the following calendar year. That is, from the last quarter of 93 to the first quarter of 94. Therefore, state enterprise accounts in the red had been built up throughout 1993, and they were about 15 trillion rubles, about 13 billion US dollars at that time, according to the mid-93 exchange rate. In June of 94, Chernomyrdin presented measures calculated to accommodate the more sensible, new class, authentic, honest government and parliament leaders, while placating the neoliberal hitmen and their Western, especially U.S. creditor banks. The Prime Minister pledged to move ahead with restructuring the economy and pursuing fiscal and monetary policies conducive to macroeconomic stabilization. At the same time, stabilization was being undermined by the puppet central bank, which issued loans to businesses at subsidized rates and by strong pressures from private industrial and agricultural lobbies seeking additional loans. The schizophrenia of this mafia new class alliance was a house that could not stand very long, any more than the U.S. Union could stand forever divided between slave and free economies. So that's what the Russian situation looked like by the end of 1994. By October of 94, inflation had been reduced by tighter fiscal and monetary policies, but however, they had earlier that year of 94, they had soared. So on October 11th, 94, the day that became known as Black Tuesday, the value of the ruble on the interbank exchange markets plunged by 27%. The loosening of credit and currency controls caused a continuing collapse in confidence in the Russian economy and its currency. In late 94, Yeltsin reasserted his commitment to macroeconomic stabilization by firing IMF economic hitman Viktor Gerashenko, head of the central bank, replacing him with Tatiana Paramonova. Now, much to Yankee chagrin, she was able to implement a tight monetary policy that ended cheap credits and restrained interest rates. Furthermore, the Parliament passed restrictions on the use of monetary policy to finance the state debt, and the Ministry of Finance began to issue government bonds at market rates to finance the deficits. The government also began to address the inter-enterprise, that is, debt between businesses, that had been feeding inflation. The 95 budget draft issued in September of 94 included a commitment to reduce inflation and budget deficits for 1995 to levels acceptable to the International Monetary Fund in order to get them to provide additional funding. The kind of thing the IMF is trying to do to Greece right now. In this budget proposal, the Chernomyrdin government sent a signal that it was surrendering to the U.S. imperialists. But this aggression by the U.S. could not be allowed to stand by an independent Russian new class. Adjusted properly, so therefore, the 1994 Russian GDP was about $4,600 per person. That is about approximately 19% of that of the United States. Now, in 1995, during most of it, the government maintained its commitment to fight fiscal constraints, and budget deficits remained within prescribed parameters. However, in 95, pressures from the Russian people mounted to increase government spending and catch up on back wages. Wage arrears had become chronic in government-owned businesses. In addition, pressure was mounting to fix the International Monetary Fund devastated social safety net, which what they do in every country. They try to wipe out every form of Social Security, medical care, education that they possibly can. In fact, in 1995 and 1996, correcting the state's failure to pay many such obligations, such as unpaid wages of government workers, was a key factor. In doing this, Russia's budget was being forced into the red. The government needed new revenue. And of course, it was difficult for it to get new revenues at first because its traditional sources of income had been sold. Political conditions changed by the second half of '95, and members of the State Duma, beginning in '94, and the lower house of the Federal Assembly of Russia's parliament, that's what the State Duma was, faced elections that December of '94. Yeltsin faced dim prospects for his '96 presidential re-election, so the parliament and the president were forced to increase spending. In addition, late in '95, Yeltsin dismissed Natalie Chubey, one of the last neoliberal economic hitmen remaining in top government position. He had been deputy prime minister in charge of economic policy. In place of Chubey, Yeltsin named Vladimir Kadanikov, a former automobile plant manager, whose views were decidedly patriotic and anti-IMF. This Chubey, who was one of the last neoliberal economic hitmen remaining in a top Russian government position, where he had been deputy prime minister in charge of economic policy. And in his place, Yeltsin nominated Vladimir Kadanikov, a former automobile plant manager whose views were decidedly patriotic and anti-IMF. Panic hit the economic hitmen in Russia, and their bosses in the U.S. began to see the possibility of defeat on the horizon for the first time since they had started the rape of Russia. Without their soldiers on Russian soil, they were reduced to having to use different kinds of pressure and making fantastic statements and threats and so on. But it's not the same thing as having tens of thousands of men with guns right outside your door. Accordingly, the U.S. insisted on replacing the RCB chair, Tatiana, and in November 1995, Yeltsin was forced to replace her with Sergei Duminin. Now, in 1996, we began to see the reversal of this locomotive to apocalypse that the U.S. and Yeltsin had set into effect, and Gorbachev, of course, before that. In mid-1996, it had been over 11 years since the great traitor Gorbachev had started his bought-and-paid-for crusade to destroy the Soviet Union, and it had been 4.5 years after the rape and ruin policy imposed by the U.S. had formally begun. It was the lowest point in Russian history, unlike anything since 1920. The Russian economy subsequently had passed through a long and wrenching depression, that is, in those years. Now, official Russian economic statistics indicated that from 1990 through the end of '95, Russian gross domestic product declined by 50%. That was far greater than the decline that the United States had suffered during the Great Depression from 1929 until the Second World War. All major sectors such as agriculture, energy, heavy and light industry had suffered. In 1996, data for the first 6 months of the year showed a continuing decline, so severe experts predicted a new phase of economic crisis in the second half of 1996. The new class needed a savior, and it needed it quick. Now let's take a look at the Mafia second economy. You'll remember that we have discussed the second economy in this lecture series several times. We discussed the fact that it existed even at the height of the Stalin years because there were important things that were not included in the plan that managers needed, and they ranged from everything from a supply of bricks that they could buy from a private producer to labor providers who had been able to get labor to managers when they needed it desperately. I won't go over all of that again, but that's how the second economy had started. By the time that Brezhnev died and Gorbachev took over, at least half of the Russian economy was in the black market area. That is, it wasn't paying taxes, but it was accounting for a very large percentage of production. An important but unconventional service in Russia's economy was what was called shuttle trading, and that was the transport and sale of consumer goods by individual entrepreneurs, of whom 5 to 10 million were estimated to be active in 1996. Now, these traders would buy goods in foreign countries such as China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and in Russian cities, and then sell them on the domestic market where the demand was highest. Yevgeny Yasin, Minister of Economics, estimated that in 1995 some U.S. $11 billion worth of goods entered Russia in this way. Shuttle traders had been vital in maintaining the standard of living of Russians who could not afford consumer goods on the conventional market. However, domestic industries such as textiles suffered from this infusion of competing merchandise, whose movement is unmonitored, untaxed, and often, if not always, mafia-controlled. The geographical distribution of Russia's wealth had been skewed at least as severely as it was in Soviet times. So by the mid-1990s, economic power was being concentrated in Moscow at an even faster rate than the federal government was losing political power in the rest of the country. In Moscow, an economic oligarchy composed of politicians, banks, business people, security forces, and city agencies controlled a huge percentage of Russia's financial assets under the rule of Moscow's energetic and popular mayor Yuri Lushkov. Unfortunately, organized crime also played a strong role in the growth of Moscow. Opposed by a weak police force, Moscow's rate of protection rackets, contract murders, kickbacks, and bribes, all intimately connected with the economic infrastructure, remained among the highest in Russia. Most businesses had not been able to function without paying some form of mafia protection, informally called akrisha, the Russian word for roof. Now, Lushkov had close ties to all the legitimate power centers in the city, and he had overseen the construction of the sports stadiums, the shopping malls, the monuments to Moscow's history, and the ornate Christ the Savior Cathedral. That's the cathedral that was originally completely blown up by Stalin around 1934, I believe. Now they want it rebuilt, and of course they did rebuild it. In '94, Yeltsin gave Lushkov full control over all state property in Moscow. In the first half of '96, the city privatized state enterprises at the rate of US $1 billion per year, a faster rate than the entire national privatization process in the same period. Under Lushkov's leadership, the city government also acquired full or major interests in a wide variety of enterprises, ranging from hotels and banking to construction to bakeries to beauty salons. Such ownership has allowed Lushkov's planners to manipulate resources efficiently and with little or no competition. However, meanwhile, Moscow had become the center of foreign investment in Russia, often to the exclusion of other regions. For example, McDonald's, fast food chain, began operations in Moscow in 1990, enjoyed immediate success, but never expanded beyond Moscow. The concentration of Russia's banking industry in Moscow gave the city a huge advantage in competing for foreign commercial advantage. When I say never expanded beyond Moscow, I mean during those first 8 years. In mid-1996, the national government appeared to have achieved some degree of macroeconomic stability. However, longer-term stability depended on the ability of the policymakers to withstand the inflationary pressures of the demands for state subsidies and easier loans for failing businesses and other special interests. Chubey estimated that spending promises made during Yeltsin's campaign amounted to $250 per voter, which, if actually spent, would approximately double the national budget deficit. Most of Yeltsin's pledges were forgotten, of course, and right after his re-election. By 1996, the structure of Russian economic output had shifted far enough that it more closely resembled that of a developed market economy than the distorted Soviet central planning model. Now, with the decline in the demand for defense industry products, overall production had shifted from heavy industry to consumer production. However, in the mid-1990s, The low quality of most domestically produced consumer goods continued to limit enterprises' profits and therefore their ability to modernize production systems. On the other side of the vicious circle, reliance on an outmoded production system guaranteed that product quality would remain low and uncompetitive, which is exactly what the U.S. and the IMF wanted. Most prices were left to the market, although local and regional governments made attempts to control the prices on some staples. Energy prices remained controlled, but the government had been shifting these prices upward to close the gap with world market prices. A 1996 government report quantified the so-called shadow economy, which yields no taxes or government statistics, as accounting for about 51% of the economy and 40% of the currency cash turnover. Now, back at the ranch, Putin was consolidating political power. On the 25th of May 1998, Putin was appointed first deputy chief of the presidential staff for the regions, and he replaced Victoria Mitina. On the 15th of July of 98, he was appointed head of the Commission for the Preparation of Agreements on the Delimitation of Power of Regions and the Federal Center attached to the President, replacing Sergei Shakray. 3. After Putin's appointment, the Commission completed no such agreements, although during Shakray's term as head of the Commission, there were 46 agreements signed. Later, after becoming President, Putin canceled all of those agreements. Number 4. On the 25th of July 1998, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin head of the FSB, one of the successor agencies to the KGB and by far the most important one. This was a position that Putin occupied until August of 1999, when he became permanent member of the Security Council of the Russian Federation on October 1st, 1998, and secretary of it on 29th of March, 1999. His first premiership began in August of 1999. On the 9th of August 1999, Vladimir Putin was appointed one of the 3 first deputy prime ministers. Later on, he was appointed acting prime minister of the government of the Russian Federation by President Yeltsin. Yeltsin also announced that he wanted to see Putin as his successor. Still later that same day, Putin agreed to run for the presidency. On August 16th of 1999, just a few days later, the State Duma approved Putin's appointment as prime minister with 233 votes in favor, 84 against, and 17 abstained. He only needed a simple majority of 226, so he certainly had it. That was required, and it made him Russia's 5th prime minister in fewer than 18 months. Now, on his appointment, few expected Vladimir Putin, virtually unknown to the public, to last any longer than his predecessors. He was initially regarded as a Yeltsin loyalist, like other prime ministers of Boris Yeltsin. But Putin did not choose his ministers himself. His cabinet was being determined by the presidential administration. Yeltsin's main opponents and would-be successors were already campaigning to replace the ailing president, and they fought hard to prevent Putin from emerging as his potential successor. But Putin's law and order image and his unrelenting approach to the Second Chechen War soon combined to raise Putin's popularity and allowed him to overtake all of his rivals. Again, he was no longer associated with any party, and Putin pledged his support to the newly formed Unity Party. This Unity Party won the second largest percentage of the popular vote, 23.3%, in the December 1990 Duma elections. Now, he has the acting presidency from 1999 through 2000, and this is an important bureaucratic step. On December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, and according to the Constitution of Russia, Putin became acting president of the Russian Federation. On assuming this role, Putin went on to previously scheduled visit of Russian troops in Chechnya. The first presidential decree that Putin signed on December 31st, 1999 was titled, quote, "On guarantees for former president of the Russian Federation and members of his family," unquote. This ensured that corruption charges against the outgoing president and his relatives would not be pursued. And later, on the 12th of February of 2001, Putin signed a similar federal law which replaced the decree of '99. In other words, Putin did for Yeltsin what Ford had done for Nixon, gave him a pardon. Now, Putin wins the election in March of 2000. While his opponents had been preparing for election in June of 2000, Yeltsin's resignation resulted in the presidential elections being held within 3 months, as constitutionally required, on 26th of March 2000, and Putin won that election in its first round with 53% of the vote. Now, that takes us through most of the rape period.